Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. That was, of course, the wonderful Amira Kier singing Sumini, Kindred Spirit, which I think is a perfect title for music for this particular show. I'm very pleased today to welcome once again to Daraja Press, Kali Akuno. Welcome, Kali. Kali is a comrade, friend, co-founder of Corporation Jackson and co-editor of Jackson Rising, published by Daraja Press. Welcome also to more than 120 people who registered for this event at Eventbrite. And there are in addition, I think, some 70 or so people who will be tuning in from various Facebook pages. So a warm welcome to you. Welcome, Kali. Nice to have you on the show.
Pleasure to be here as always, Feroz. Looking forward to it.
Well, what provoked me to invite you today is that you wrote a really interesting piece at Navigating the Storm, Blogspot, in which you commented, we have a little less than 2 years before the neo-confederates and neo-fascists install a reactionary dictatorship by the end of January 2025. Okay, so you foresee this neo-confederates, ultra-right-wing taking power in 2025. Help us understand why you have come to that conclusion.
Well, first and foremost, the successful organizing campaign of the right. And folks have to understand, I think, come to grips with that this is a decades-long organizing campaign. It's not something that emerged, just kind of willy-nilly over the past, 4 or 5 years. It's not something that Trump created. It's more or less something that actually he has kind of rode the wave on, really, and it's been building towards some critical points for some time. And we've all been watching this play out as the United States and this political body, the polity, has moved steadily towards the right. I would argue fundamentally since the days of Richard Nixon. And almost each election cycle, what is proposed has either been a very willful and intentional deconstruction of both New Deal policies and the Great Society policies, and the restoration of the very foundations and notions of, the O'Hare-invoked republic, or the apartheid, republic that existed prior to the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. And that's been an intentional deconstruction. And this has been taking place. Now, what makes some of this a little bit more alarming is that, where that movement has been gaining momentum for quite some time, it was somewhat divorced from the more armed, militant section of the right-wing movement, which, at least for a good portion of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, these violent factions in the form of the Klan or the form of neo-Nazis. Many might remember the resurgence of kind of Klan and white supremacist activities in the 1980s, going so far as having David Duke being one of the most, noted members of the Klan who actually won several elections in the state of Louisiana in the 1980s, being a champion of that. So that tendency has always been there, but it was relegated to the outskirts, if you would, particularly of the organized right, which in this country, since at least the 1950s, has been somewhat encapsulated within the framework of the Republican Party. But basically, I would argue since the days of Barry Goldwater in that campaign in 1964, all the different fringe aspects of what people once thought of the right that were relegated, to the outskirts, to the land of conspiracy, to the land of, small talk shop radio. They have now gradually occupied the mainstream, are now in control not only of the party apparatus, but they represent and are each day becoming more consolidated, right, with the survivalists, the white supremacists forces that have been gaining and amassing strength, largely outside of the purview of most of the mainstream media. And that because, let me be very clear, it's not like these forces have just emerged. Folks just didn't pay enough attention. And I've been one of the people who've been trying to raise an alarm for many years, almost 2 decades, that our side of the equation was not taking them seriously and not looking at the power that they were amassing and how successful in their organizing endeavors that they were. And it was kind of a willful ignorance. And then, during the Obama years, the Koch brothers basically, and they weren't alone, but the Koch brothers basically took elements of what existed, gave it funding, and then gave it political life, and basically just unleashed, a mad pit bull, basically on the body politic, which moved from the margins to the mainstream. And that group fundamentally has had an agenda, I would argue, from the 1970s, of looking at the United States government and looking at the kind of liberal forces that have been in control of the United States government for most of, I would argue, the 20th century. They flipped the script and not just looked at Black people or Mexicans or Mexicanos or Chicanos or Puerto Ricans, et cetera, indigenous people as the enemy, but if switched that anger and looked at the state, which was forced to give up some rights and some space, political space, to those forces as a result of the social struggles of the 20th century, that didn't look at that entity as something which is abhorrent and something that they needed to fight. This is the movement which is in control now. And it's some of its stated aims, if anybody's ever paid attention to it on its own terms, since the 1980s, was that they needed to actually construct and initiate a civil war in order to achieve their political aims and objectives. And, I'm one who's first started really paying attention to them in the 1980s. And oddly enough, what part of what made me take them seriously, if you would, was doing radio, in the early 1990s, first in college and then, more in the community and even in the kind of a commercial space.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what, myself and some of the comrades I was working with at that time, we were looking to create a media and communications infrastructure that the left could own and control autonomously. And so the thing that we thought would be the lowest kind of entry point that could reach the widest audience, this is before the days of the widespread internet, was, radio, right? Particularly low wave radio. That's something people can do in all their communities. So I was often in many spaces, this is in California, many spaces getting trained in like the hard skills of how to build these equipment and how to, staff it, man it, how to operate it, right, with a bunch of right-wing wingnuts, right, who were getting the same skills and training as I was. And so I got a chance to kind of see up close what they were thinking, how they were operating, how they were organizing. And I saw, with my own eyes in the early 1990s, how they were being more effective as essentially the same strategy for their forces that we were. right? And I was arguing, this is going back to the 90s, arguing with many comrades, like, look, we may have built 1 or 2 radio stations, in the course of 3 or 4 years, right? We just couldn't get our act together broadly enough to do that. On the other side of the equation, they were doing 3 and 4 radio stations a month,
Wow.
right? That were pumping up. And the critical thing that I understood is, if that is the only voice that is reaching those who don't feel like they have a voice, and particularly in rural and suburban areas, right? And they set up a format which you see Fox later emulated, I think, with great success, of kind of creating a phony dialogue, but at least a dialogue, a feedback loop, if you would, of making people feel that their voices were heard, that their points were being in consideration. It's like, that's a form of organizing. If we're not doing that and they're providing that, what do you think the politics are eventually going to go? And so all of these, what people now think are crazy conspiracy theories and alternate facts, that was standard currency in those movements in the 1980s and the 1990s. And now it's become mainstream currency because we've been outflanked, we've been out organized, right? And this is the political aim and objective that they want to go. So that's one thing. The other thing is a deeper structural issue, right? And the deeper structural issue is, I would argue that there's just some fundamental limits to capital being able to reproduce itself. And what that now engenders is that those who are in control of the vast majority of the world's resources, they're battening down the hatches, and either trying to do one or two things. Either coming up with these elaborate contrived escape routes, a la the Elon Musk's plan to go to the moon, and then eventually to go to Mars, rather than spending all the resources that he has to actually fix problems here on Earth. Or the other one is bunkering into deep silos, preparing for kind of end of days. But either way, it's stripping the society of fundamental resources and concentrating them in fewer and fewer hands. And that is another dynamic that I think we have to pay attention to. And in order for them to move in accordance with resolving the declining level of resources on the heels of what people understand and see with their real eyes as a coming ecological collapse, right, which is definitely accelerating, rather than trying to transform our practices on a systemic level to reduce carbon emissions, or to reduce methane emissions, to come up with new systems of production. It's been fundamentally resolved by the ruling class that we're not going to change, but what we can do is control the little resources that are left. And this right-wing orientation, this right-wing movement, is the political response to this. We gotta let's steal everything that can be stolen. It's harder for ourselves, and make sure that access is limited to it. Those are the two things that to me are pointing very clearly and concretely, towards major civil strife, not only in the United States. I want people, but this last article was focused on the United States, but we see these tensions on a global scale, not just in the United States. There's a strong movement, right-wing movement where you are in Quebec, and in Canada, that one probably couldn't imagine existing there politically even 10 years ago. Yeah. Same in the UK, same throughout most of Europe, same in India, Turkey. I can go on and on. Brazil, we see this phenomenon, and it's rooted in the material contradictions of the system that we live in, with all of the different corresponding systems of oppression that have been built up to support the capitalist system in the form of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, etc., and then all the revanchist stuff that goes with establishing law and order as a means of kind of population control and resource management. That's what's driving us there.
So, okay. So, what should be done to confront the advance of the ultra-reactionary dictatorship? What's your perspective on that?
Well, one of the first things I think we need to really do is stop organizing necessarily and orient ourselves towards kind of a deficit model of particularly around the resource question. And what do I mean by that, right? You could read part of my article about making sure that there's food security and there's basis you can read part of that as a lurch towards just a type of isolationism. That would be the wrong read. That's not what I'm advocating for, right?
Mhm.
What I'm advocating for there is a basic level of security in the face of being out organized in this particular point in time, to make sure that we have some places of operation to continue to fight on. But as I caution there, that's not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough to just do mutual aid and solidarity, within a small radius or community radius. There has to be a political focus to the fight back, to the resistance, right? And there, I think we need to figure out the common currency there is, how do we create a politics, an illicit politics that is about solidarity, even in the face of shortages, right? And that is where we, I think, have to start treading into, more the territory of both producing for ourselves to the greatest extent possible, but making sure that we are engaged in a level of community, horizontal democratic planning and exchange, where we can both understand the needs of those in our community and then plan to meet the needs of those in our community with the resources that we have available. And this is going to be critical to make sure that certain folks within our community are not forgotten or not left out, and then have to themselves move on a politics which is fundamentally about security. Because a lot of the fundamental politics around security ultimately lead us towards right-oriented positions, right? And that is where I think we have to kind of get out of this scarcity kind of mode ourselves and figure out, well, how do we open up? How do we generate more resources that could then be shared and exchanged and bartered and, on an equal basis with those in our community? It's a different orientation that we have to take. And I want to really start there, because I think a large part of this structure, the struggle in the United States, we forget the productive aspect that we ourselves have to be engaged in, right? And we just automatically kind of go to, well, how do we mobilize more people than the right, either, to kind of vote them out of office, which they are very successfully blocking that as any kind of successful route, or we just bring the system to a standstill. And I want
Mhm.
to be clear. I think that we are going to have to get to a level of being able to execute a general strike in order to beat some of these forces back. But we're going to have to have our own productive systems up to capacity where we can meet the needs of our community, right? To be able to sustain that, not just for a day or two, but oftentimes I think, we need to be real that some of this is going to need to be sustained for a long period of time, given how dug in the right is in many areas within the
But,
United States.
but I mean, help us give some concrete examples. I mean, you've been working around the whole issue of mutual aid, of building up cooperatives, and you talk also about building up self-defense networks. So, but
Mhm.
help us understand concretely what this looks like. I mean, for example, in Jackson, Mississippi. I mean, what does it look like through the work that you've been doing at Cooperation Jackson? What kind of political choices are you making, and how should people therefore approach it in their own vicinity? So, we need some
Mhm.
concrete examples which help
Right,
people
right,
to think about what can be done.
right. This part of what makes it difficult to answer that from the Cooperation Jackson perspective. I'll try, but I just want folks to be clear. Our model was in part premised on a future like this likely coming into being. Right, it was kind of our analysis that we were heading this direction anyway.
Hmm.
And so, what did that lead us to do? It led us very early on in our existence. We've only been around; it'll be 8 years coming up soon, and we prioritized, acquiring as much land as we could, over above almost anything else, and decommodifying it to the greatest extent possible. And in our context, within the framework and the limitations of bourgeois law in the United States, that's in the form of a community land trust that we have. So the Fannie New Hampshire Community Land Trust. And our priority has been from day one is to build our capacity to have food security in our community and build the relationships because it's not something Cooperation Jackson can do, but try to build and extend the relationships with other forces in our community to create a food sovereignty network and a food sovereignty system. That way we can meet the caloric needs of our community. And this is something we've been working on both on the material level with farming, with Freedom Farms, but also the political organizing and agitation, laying the groundwork for folks to understand, hey, there may be a time and a place in a situation where we need this. I think I can successfully say that over the course, particularly the last 2 years, the pandemic, I think, helped to focus this up, as there's been some chronic shortages in our area as there has been in other places. So the rationale and the argument of why we needed to increase local food production, the pandemic somewhat proved that point and demonstrated that to us. And there's far more local food production in town than there was, say, 2 years ago. Right now, it's still not at the level where we could say we could take care of the caloric needs, if need be, for a month or 2 months of the 160,000 plus people that live in Jackson. But I think the foundation has been laid where through the organizing work of these last 8 years, where now we have the ability to ramp up production, which is what we're aiming to do in 2022, to better meet that need, because the situation and how people are reading it, not just us, but other people in our community are reading, the banning of books and the banning of curriculum and restricting voting rights. People are seeing the writing on the wall, in part knowing our own, painful history as a people with the fall of the Reconstruction governments and how things can, both go forwards and then, lurch backwards. Black people are painfully aware of that kind of on a mass level, given our history. And so that consciousness is being stirred up by the circumstances, and people are moving in that direction. What I would articulate for folks who are listening to this is to start having these conversations in your community, with your neighbors, with your churches or synagogues, mosques, unions, and start focusing and building up the capacity in your community to be able to engage in these acts of both solidarity and mutual aid and self-protection. Now, the self-protection piece in Jackson, again, we in the deep Southern context, the fight against white supremacy, which has been ongoing and generational, there's already a certain consciousness of that exists in our community of folks having to be prepared for the violence of the right, because it's not like that ever stopped, right, in the context that we live in. But harnessing that and trying to organize it now for more broader defensive mechanisms against the potential incursion of forces from the forces of white supremacy, particularly to our east over in like Rankin County. That is becoming much more, again, also ubiquitous, again, because the political writing has been somewhat on the wall more in Mississippi for quite some time. You can go back to the early 2000s in Mississippi, what some of the things that people are experiencing in terms of how they are manipulating, the voting maps and the redistricting. They did all that, almost 20 years ago in Mississippi, and created, even though, with close to 40% of Mississippi's population is Black, we exist in a space already where there are, just by way of an example, there is no state, there is not a Democrat which holds a state office, i.e. meaning a Black person who holds a state office in the state of Mississippi, right? Because of the fabricated supermajorities within the state legislature that they have constructed using all of the tactics that you now see being employed in Florida and Texas and about I think it's about 15 or 16 other states, Arizona, right, Wisconsin, Minnesota. So we were already a test run for that, and how successful and how blocking and limited it can be. Right. And so that's stepping up. In other communities, right? All these things in my argument, I would say, need to go together. Like, you cannot really have, particularly in this context, a really functioning kind of mutual aid network that doesn't have a security component. And let me be clear what I mean by security. The first element of security is knowledge and information, right? Knowing who is in your community, your own kind of power mapping and assessment, knowing who in your community, where they stand on certain issues, where they're likely to fall on certain issues, and then making determinations: can they be worked with, or do they have to be worked against? And without that knowledge, you could do kind of like the right. The right is buying all the guns and ammo that they can get. You can try to do that and mimic that, and it won't actually succeed or fail. It won't actually succeed. It will more than likely fail because we have to come to grips that at this stage of the game, the left is not in the United States. The left is not going to outgun or outbullet the right. They got too much an advantage on that. So we're going to have to primarily gear up with more superior organization in the quickest amount of time that we can. That is going to have to be our route.
I think that's a really, really important point you're making there, because in your essay, you talk about building up self-defense, and that could easily be interpreted as just stocking up with arms, etc. And I think what you're posing is something I think would be really important to elaborate upon in your next article, perhaps. Mm-hmm. What does self-defense mean? What does it mean politically? What does it mean in terms of organizing? There's another question.
That's already on deck, Feroz, because people are misconstruing that.
Great. One other thing I want to just sort of touch on, and I mean, we keep coming back to Cooperation Jackson. I mean, leading the way, certainly in terms of giving expression to that experience of, as you wrote in Jackson Rising. But also in Jackson Rising, you covered this whole issue of how many other cooperatives across the United States are doing something similar. Mm-hmm. I mean, can you give us some sort of sense of, when you say you need to network with these people, what's going on? Is it just Cooperation Jackson, or is it something more organic happening beyond Jackson, Mississippi?
Oh, something far more organic than just Jackson, Mississippi. In the United States, I think this last 10 years, there's been a profound growth in the cooperative sector. And I don't see it at this rate stopping. When you look at the work of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, or the work of the New Economies Coalition, or the work of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, or more close to home in our area, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, all of these are growing, exponentially. Right. And most of them are being guided by folks who actually are very grounded in left politics, so it's not just kind of co-ops for co-op's sake. I think this generation is folks really trying to develop a solid kind of anti-capitalist practice and orientation, just in the general terms. And folks are coming at that, some are socialists, some is communists, some is anarchists, some is revolutionary nationalists. So this work is being done by a broad array of forces. Where we are limited, I think, right now in every fashion, is that while the sector is growing, if you want to call it that, while it's growing, it's still not at a place where its productive capacity is yielding enough in any community to kind of provide a bunch of essential services. I know we have taken some major leaps and bounds in our productive capacity. The last 2 years, actually under the pandemic, has been a major leap, but it's still far from where we wanted to go in any sector, being able to meet the broad scale of the needs of the people in our community. So there's a level of breadth that's happening, but the level of depth to being able to either provide more jobs or do more productive, that piece still has to kind of really accelerate. But I think some of the things that where there seems to be right now, the most advanced networking is in folks trying to figure out alternative ways of securing finance, right, to be able to start these cooperatives. And now I think now the next step, particularly under these political terms and conditions, is how do we turn these things into the organizing basis combined with these resources to be able to be this kind of mutual aid, solidarity, broad self-defense, and democratic operating spaces in our community. That is something that I know we are going to try to push the kind of the co-op sector, the solidarity economy sector to do. And have been in some good conversations, particularly within the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, that are starting along that journey. And then for us, just so folks know, we took the initiative with several kind of sister organizations to try to, start getting in advance, specifically to deal with this ongoing, crisis of confronting the right, called the People's Network for Land and Liberation. And that is Cooperation Jackson, Cooperation Humboldt, Survivors Village in New Orleans, Community Movement Builders, primarily based in Atlanta, but also forces in Detroit and elsewhere that relate to community movement builders, and then Building Fearless Futures and the Center for Grassroots Organizing up in Vermont, and in the process of helping folks there build a sister cooperation Vermont, which is developing and putting the thing there. And the core pieces that was really built around was a combination of folks who had land-based kind of projects and orientation, mainly community land trusts, all engaged in some form of process of decommodifying, and to the greatest extent possible, decolonizing the land. And Cooperation Humboldt, I think, is in the most advanced, there. And I think developing a model with DISCOMA that I think is one that in the future, hopefully, many folks could emulate. And then the other piece is, having the community land trust, and then also being in a direct component of cooperative development with an anti-capitalist lens and orientation, to where we're trying to produce more for need than for profit, right? In our communities. And so trying to build this up so that we can pull resources together, provide these foundations, increase our productive capacity, particularly in the realm of food production and medicine production in the form of natural medicines, which, if things really go bad, that's what folks are going to really have to learn how to do. So trying to, get a heads up on that, and be the best model and example that we can be at reorienting solidarity economy work with these particular political objectives in mind, right? Of one, beating back the right, but also setting up a practice and dynamic of trying to struggle our way through of building eco-socialism, from below.
Right. Well, there are quite a number of questions that have come through, and I wonder if I could just pose a few of them, and maybe you take a selection of them. The first one is from Christina. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you blanked out on me for a second, but you're back now.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. Anyway, the question here is how can people focus their efforts on organizing with the intentional toxicity, I think it's a very good phrase, that the right wing brings to the community, which affects mental health and motivation. Another question is from Anna Horty. If time permits, what role can worker-owned co-ops play, particularly small businesses with boomer owners exiting? A third question, and here we have, this dilemma we have. The Democratic Party is viewed by some as part of the organized right, despite its seeming liberal positions on social issues. And they continue, talks about where the Republican Party is a welcoming home for racists and white nationalists. The Democrats are the face of the fascist imperialist state. Both the parties have served capital. I mean, those
Absolutely.
are two
Absolutely.
batches of questions. There's some more
Hmm.
which we'll take on.
Hmm.
But you want to take up those 2 points?
Yeah, well, I mean, I take great pains to describe the forces most willing and most desirous of engaging in political violence to accomplish dictatorship, in the near term, as neo-confederates and neo-fascists. To make some, I think, critical, both tactical and strategic points of distinction about the right. Because I include the Democratic Party as a force of the right. I don't exclude it from being that, right? And what many people call liberals, most people in the rest of the world will call liberal in the United States context. Most people throughout the world will call them outright conservatives to begin with, right? So um, I think we need to be very clear and precise. And one of the reasons why we need to be as clear and precise as possible is to try to split as many of these forces off from the more extreme forces, if you would, to the greatest extent possible. We have to fracture their forces. Let's just be clear and possible if we want to not see this project consolidate for long-term rule. And I think a large part of that, this is to link those two. I think the cooperative sector is going to have to play a lead role in that, right? Because that is where we're going to have to, I think, really invite a lot of folks who are susceptible to their messages in, particularly on the community level, and meet them at the basic level of how do we meet their issues and how do we address their issues of economic insecurity. Right, like
Right.
that is going to have to be a pivotal point, I think, particularly in a lot of white communities, right? And there has to be a concerted effort to split white working class forces from the white petty bourgeois forces, which are the crux of this reactionary movement. So, if folks really want to take a deep dive and just look at who showed up, for instance, on January 6th, like those were mainly petty bourgeois forces, right? Folks flying on their private jets and paying for hotels. It wasn't your normal mass movement of folks camping out and staying in solidarity. This had a particular kind of class orientation to it, and its leadership is definitely drawn from that sector. But I think there's a point to it. Now, somewhat anecdotal, but I think there's a lot of truth to it, to where we saw in 2016, and to a certain extent in the 2020 campaign, when you laid out some of the rationale, for instance, of Bernie Sanders' more Keynesian social democratic policies and orientation, a number of the voters, a good chunk of them, uh, you know, would have went with Bernie even more than they would have went with Trump by a lot of indications. And the Democrats totally ignored that economic argument and rationality. We can't afford to do that, right? Because I know my community needs it, and most communities throughout the empire need it. Now, the organizing orientation to make sure that there's real equity and there's a real program that's centered on fighting issues of patriarchy, issues of heterosexism, white supremacy within the context of our communities. Those struggles are still going to have to take place kind of on the local community level. But I think the base starting place for us to start articulating a program that is centered on reorganizing the economic foundations of this society. That I think will bring in a whole different set of forces and create splits within this coalition that these kind of ultra-right forces are trying to create. And you see elements of it that concern, like the right populism around bringing jobs back and all that different thing, where it resonates. And we have to flip that and really give it the clear, a clear analysis within the framework of imperialism around nobody stole your job. Imperialism, moved that in search of greater profits, in the search of places that didn't have certain kind of protections, for the laborers or worker standards. And so we're not in competition with other folks at any other place on the planet on the basis of them trying to meet their basic material needs, right? We want everybody to do that as internationalists. The question for us is, how do we serve our community to make sure that we can control the labor processes and the reproductive processes in our own community through broad democratic control, like democrat, not just seizing the means of production, so that they're in community hands. It won't just the seizing them without a broad democratic process of how they operated, and how decisions are made around production. If we don't have those two things together, then we're replicating many of the mistakes of the past. So we have to bring those things together. And I would say that the first question around how do we deal with some of the toxicity of the right, we're going to have to, I think it's through some of these issues that we cut across that. I don't expect, overnight, those who've been, socialized in these systems to kind of immediately change. But I think we have to find the places, particularly in a lot of these local places and, rural places and suburban places where left forces are more often than not going to be outnumbered. You got to find ways to split their forces and engage and move them to a different position. And sometimes that's going to mean, listening to and finding the best and most effective ways to challenge the backwards ideas around, a race, class, and gender that folks have, but organizing them towards a broader point of solidarity. This is going to be some of the concrete struggle we're going to have to engage if we're going to defeat these forces in the long term.
Okay, what I suggest we do is just take maybe a 30-second break just here, just to give people time to reflect on some of the things that you're saying. There are a lot of questions coming in, but there are a number of issues that I'd like to tease out from you. So let's just give a short break on that. Yeah, that's the amazing Amira Kir singing Samiri. Okay, look, I mean, just to get back to some of the issues that you've raised in the article, one of the things you mentioned is, and it comes directly from the experience of Cooperation Jackson, is the need for people's assemblies. You were talking about, creating the democratic structures, etc. I mean, I know that there was a very vibrant time in the early days at the time of Chokwe Lumumba as mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. But would I be right in saying that the enthusiasm for public assemblies waned since? So if that is the case, I mean, what's needed to make it happen again? What advice have you got on that? And before the program, you were telling me about how badly everyone has been affected in Jackson, Mississippi, and yourselves personally with the COVID pandemic. So, how feasible is it now to call for people's assemblies?
That's going to vary from community to community. And folks are going to have to respond to organizing them, based upon the conditions in your community, particularly with COVID, on the prowl. And I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. Let's be clear about that. But what I can say, the first part of your question, for Rose, there definitely was a waning of participation in the kind of the broad assemblies in communal kind of activity in that regard shortly after Chokwe died. But over the last 3 years, the interest has picked back up. And so that's one of the things, these things go up and down, Right. We were able in 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, we were able to actually hold 3 fairly successful people's assemblies, right? And not only were we holding people's assemblies in Jackson, The mayor, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, and allied forces were also doing assemblies. There was a third group that was also doing assemblies, and all of them had some slightly different variations and to a certain degree of kind of competition. I think a healthy one in this case going on. But the important part of all this, despite there being three, some people might look at that as a distraction. I didn't look at it that way. Still don't look at it that way, because it got more people involved, right? It got more people elicited, and it meant that, and I think it still means in our case, that there is a more acceptance of the form and acceptance of the practice of trying to create, right, direct and deliberative democracy. And that's a healthy thing, right? So, there could be 100 of them, and it probably still wouldn't be enough in our own little, city. Still not might be enough to fully engage all of the people. But that is something we should be aspiring to, is what I would say. So I think if we, in a period like this, right, what I was articulating, particularly in that piece, is that how we move out of the mere kind of mutual aid into a broader process of political struggle, I would argue is going to have to be through broad democratic vehicles, even in the midst of a period of intense reaction, like people's assemblies, right? That people are governing and moving themselves and moving directly. That is going to be fundamental to all the security information that people are going to need, determining assessments of what's going to happen, and then figuring out, most importantly, the strategy and tactics of how each one of these communities are going to actually fight back, and what resources they have to fight back with. This is what's going to enable, I think, the broadest organization in the shortest amount of time that we have, because that's one of the deficits what we've seen, in my view, that we've seen in the last 10 years, some profound social movement responses within the United States. If you want to put Occupy on one bookend and the Floyd Rebellion, in 2021, 2020, on the other, both of those were deeply impactful and very broad and deep, and cut both across race and class in some really fundamental ways that movements in the United States have been aspiring to for a long time. The weakness is that they haven't engendered kind of long-term radical organization. And we have to kind of put this People's Assembly, broad democratic participation in and combine it with this energy of the mass movement and the mass spontaneous forces that have emerged as a point of struggle within the United States, and to a certain extent all over the world during this last period, and to do so in direct contravention of what we see coming down with the right, and
Right.
and having that and being clear that it's going to take a mass force even greater than what we saw in 2020 with George Floyd, the George Floyd rebellion, to be able, I think, to withstand the first levels of shock. I think particularly, and there's going to be two, in my view, there's going to be two waves of this. And I think we just need to be clear and start, game planning for them, quite honestly, right? So I think there'll be one level of assault that's going to come down beginning in January 2023. And that will be really the Senate and the House and the Supreme Court really backing what many of these states are doing in establishing the precedent of law and the protections that have kind of been afforded of that, the removing of rights, right? Either a woman's right to choose and have a body autonomy, or people's kind of the broad elective principles. Like, that's going to be pretty much locked in, both on the judicial aspect, and they'll probably usher in a whole bunch of series of laws on a federal level that will lock in the things that they're doing on a state level. And then with that, there'll come a certain kind of wave of repression if they're able successfully to kind of pull that off. And we see this. I'm not talking about something that's speculative. I mean, we just look at what's been going on, the last 10 years of the same period of time of penalizing protests, like making it illegal to protest against oil companies or against fracking or against the pipelines, right? Like Oklahoma is kind of one of the ground centers where it's just straight up illegal to do that, or making it legal to like plow people down with cars in the middle of the protest in response to Black Lives Matter. These are things that they already have on the books that you can imagine becoming federalized once they have, their majorities. And folks need to be very clear. The right is a far more consolidated force. So when Mitch McConnell has control of the Senate again, which will likely happen, by January 2023, given all the projections and scenarios, best believe that he won't have any problem moving whatever policy he wants with 51 votes. He'll make sure that if he needs to break any kind of filibuster, whatever, all this whole charade that we just saw and witnessed and saw play out, his side won't have a problem moving in lockstep fashion. So they'll move on that pretty quickly. And then we're going to need to figure out how to respond to that. I think first and foremost on all our local levels, but it's going to have to be nationally linked, and we're going to have to also call for some international support and solidarity amongst this to really kind of break through. And the place ultimately where we want to have to break through is on the economic plane. Let's just be clear fundamentally about that. Like, making these forces really feel it in their pocket is where that's ultimately going to bring about some change. But in the course of doing that, we got to make sure we meet the material needs of our own communities, which are already most often, than not, suffering from various forms of deprivation, either from, the inherent inequality of the capitalist market, or the much more intentional, deliberate things of denying medicines or having things being totally dictated by the profit motive to determine access. So we're going to have to be upfront about confronting that. And then 2025, if it's Trump, which it very well could be, or somebody, a Trump-like character, somebody who was learned from his style and modus of politics, like a DeSantis from Florida, who I think will likely be the main candidate, but they got other ones in the wings as well. Somebody like that coming into office, we definitely going to have to be prepared for that, because it's going to be, lockstep with control over all three branches of government. And then we'll be, I would argue we'll probably be looking for, again, taking what they say, particularly Trump, taking what he says for face value and to be fact. I'm one who always said, when the man tells you something, actually believe it. So when he tells you he didn't, he told the world he didn't really believe in the Constitution. He said that during the first 100 days of his presidency, when they do that little kind of standard symbolic thing, he said straight up that the Constitution was a problem and was getting his way. And the people thought he was joking and say, no, when he tells you that, you should have believed him, right? He told you very clearly, what he thought. And he's made, some very clear indication that he would like to be president for life. We best believe him when he says that and start organizing and getting prepared for that to be a potentiality.
Let's move on to this question of what needs to be done. You speak about forging alliances, but you're also dismissive of what you refer to as popular fronts. People may not be necessarily familiar with that term or its history. What have you got against so-called popular fronts?
That's a whole nother show in dialogue, for those. But no, let's make it real and concrete. For those who don't know, this term popular front particularly grows out of the history of the Communist Party and how it in the 1930s and into the early 1940s decided that fascism had to be fought on the international level. And the basis of that was not just relying upon united fronts, which within that characteristic at the time was trying to move all the different forces within the working class into kind of one broad political alignment to fight back. The Popular Front was opening it up to multi-class alliances with petty bourgeois forces and alliance with certain sectors of the bourgeoisie when and where it was possible, to try to defeat what that they viewed to be the most reactionary force, which was fascism, right? So that was the general articulation. But what wound up happening within that articulation is dominated, I would say, a lot of politics in Western Europe and in North America, i.e. Canada. What I mean by that, Canada and the United States in particular, has been this total removing of the question of socialism from the equation, right? And just trying to articulate a much more kind of social democratic position of, we'll kind of graduate ourselves to that point through electoral majorities, as if the bourgeoisie would allow democracy to get in the way of their rule. They never have, and they never will. Like, that's a charade that has been played primarily in the West because it's been the center of the imperialist system, the core, where most of the points of extraction come from. But if you look at the broad experience on a global scale, that is what our barometer should be in democracy, particularly what we know as bourgeois democracy, has always been in short supply and very, specifically denied anybody. And that's the point, right? So my point is that should we, in this time period, try to be united with all who can be united with? Yes, of course. But that does not mean, and it should not mean, we follow their political agenda and the dictates that come from their agenda. So what this means in practical and the concrete, if we just leave it to our alliances with the Democratic Party, right, it would just be, let's vote. Let's just limit ourselves to voting these folks out of office. And then whatever we dictate to you after that will be the best that you're going to get. And what does that concretely look like? So there's in the midst of a pandemic, right, you had an electoral campaign, which in 2020, in 2019, even before the pandemic really busted out, you had a mass conversation and somewhat of a movement, arguing for and fighting for and articulating a program of universal health coverage within the United States. And because the Democratic leadership decided that that would interfere too much with the market, they basically removed it from the equation, even in the midst of a pandemic. And so what that winds up looking like in practice, you now have a Democratic president in the midst of a pandemic who's losing major points in credibility by the day, what is kind of confused vaccine mandates, which are really about how do we support, how do we force people to get back to work as quickly as possible, to keep the economy flowing. They just had a better rhetoric around it than what the right is. But there's no conversation. It's been totally removed from introducing universal basic health coverage, which is fundamentally the more real solution that will be needed, not only to deal with this health crisis, but the other things that are underneath this, in terms of some of the more chronic things that made so many people particularly vulnerable to this pandemic, with heart problems and diabetes, etc. There's no conversation, and not because there's not a movement per se of folks who are still kind of articulating that. The forces within the DSA, they're still around. They're still part of their platform, the campaign. But there's been an alliance with folks that told them that you guys got to shut that out for us to be able to move some things rather than continue to agitate it. And thus, as a result, there's no conversation, even in the middle of a major pandemic that's probably killed more than 1 million people in the United States, about healthcare.
Okay, so what's the alternative? What kind of alliance should be built?
If we don't organize in our own interests, right? All those different things independently, all those things are going to be lost. So what I'm advocating for, we need to build, these broad alliances in the name of our own interests. Like, that is what's going to have to happen, and not compromise on that. That's the critical thing. Not fall victim to, like, well, you can't raise, in the midst of fighting back against the right, we can't raise these economic questions, or we can't raise questions around decolonization, or we can't raise questions around gender parity. We can't raise these questions, so we just have to defeat the right. No, don't fall victim to that, right? That we need to make sure all these things are on the table, because this fight is more, you got your immediate piece of making sure that this repressive end doesn't come back around, but you don't want to leave the agenda basically up to the neoliberals who enabled this madness to come into being in the first place, right? So we have to look at this, I would argue, as a major point of opportunity to totally shift both the narrative, the debate, but also the points of power in a very quick, point in time. This is as much as opportunity for us, if we are serious, as it is for the right. And that's the part that I don't want to get lost.
Right. So, but I mean, you're calling for mass mobilizations of millions,
Mm-hmm.
And you point to sort of, there's a long experience of this kind during the last decade, and you point to just earlier on the George Floyd uprisings,
Right.
the movement Black Lives Matter. I was in another webinar earlier today, and Lou Turner used a very interesting phrase. He said, "It's better to call these moments than movements. They've not
Movements. Yeah.
yet formed into, but it is a really important moment." Given that, what's the base? How do we mobilize the millions to prevent what you're describing as happening in
Mm-hmm.
January 2025? Um, and let's more concretely, I mean, you guys at Jackson Corporation Jackson have done an incredible amount of work on the people's strike, and in trying to mobilize around that. I mean, help us understand what are the lessons that you've learned from
Right.
that, and what are the possibilities given the weakness of the left, given that we are in a moment but not yet sufficient to describe
Mm-hmm.
it as a movement.
Well, I'll take it back to like the people strike piece that we tried to initiate in response to the pandemic. I think the message was on point, but I think it was the wrong moment, as history would have us bear. It would bear out. What do I mean by that? I think um, fighting a virus was a little too abstract for folks to kind of wrap their heads around, right? Particularly before there was kind of a some form of vaccine, right? Some form of prophylaxis to be able to kind of confront it. And the initial calls that we were putting out, I think, of moving towards a general strike, and that was a piece that we tried to articulate. Like, we need to move in that way because we saw that as an opportunity for profound social transformation, that we could make things like, again, the universal health coverage like a reality. Like, there was a potential moment of doing that. But it seemed that most of the established forces in the trade unions and some of the bigger alliances that we reached out to and tried to have political dialogue, it was too adventurous in their view to be calling something. And that, to me, was one of the pieces that this piece grows off of. It was a wake-up call as to the degree to which I would say many of the organized forces found themselves also to be very limited by the weaknesses within their own organizations, of not really knowing that if they put out a call that people would respond. So that was a critical piece. But then that was kind of shown to be somewhat inadequate, again, learning from history, by the Floyd Rebellion. And that was something that you could kind of predict, that there was a kind of a energy, but nobody knows the form or fashion or the time when something like that would erupt. You can say that there's kindling out there for it, but you don't know what's going to light the spark. So that lit a spark, but there was some prep work, that was done on that. We need to, I think, kind of emulate that. And I think this go around of being confronted, with the threat of a neo-confederate, neo-fascist takeover, that's much more concrete. So the message, I think, is a little bit much more easy for folks to grasp. But does that necessarily mean that the political forces would be willing to take it a step beyond just kind of stopping the right assault? That's an open question for Rose. I think we need to be honest and clear about that. And thus, that was my insistence in this piece of trying to articulate, like, let's learn the deeper lessons of history about the limitations of many of our own efforts, both ideologically and politically, and to the greatest extent possible, not fall into those traps. And to see this is also an opening and opportunity for us, right, for the left.
Right.
Now, I think this period is going to call for, and that's why I wrote this, and hopefully some people and forces within, the Democratic Socialists of America, or Movement for Black Lives, or some of the other kind of broad alliances of stuff, forces in the NAACP, people will hear this, go read the paper, go read some of the other things like the Shifting Focus piece that me and some other comrades did, which this is kind of a minor kind of a company too, and pick that up and start utilizing the organized apparatuses that do exist in their communicative networks to start doing the prep work in the hearing now of doing, laying out an analysis, right? And engaging folks in the structures in their communities or within their organizations to start having these kind of broad discussions in people's assemblies or their own membership gatherings, and then be prepared to start doing some planning both on the material side of the equation to be prepared for some things that might come down to the worst, like set up those things, the mutual aid stuff, start thinking and planning and executing it now. But on the more political side, start getting prepared to have some action plans of what we should do post November elections, what we should do all the way through January and beyond, the first kind of 6 months, and then be in broad dialogue with forces of like mind to not only call for kind of a mass response within those networks, but to do us kind of much planning and joint coordination in the here and now ahead of time as much as possible. And I'm talking about things that are well beyond just to get out the vote, right? Like people are going to do that. People know how to do that. There's a machine apparatus to set that up, fine. But we're going to need something for when and if that fails, or when and if it's limited by the structures that get set up. And to start making some concrete demands upon the liberal forces in the state, like right now, not just wait till later, because right now what it seems to be clear at this juncture in the road, that all the Democrats really have are fundamentally two things, which are themselves very limited. So they have the State Department, the State Department, Department of Justice in particular, right, to really go at the restrictions on the voting rights laws, the fight against the all this stuff against them coming up with more crazy polluting policies, or them eliminating abortion in state after state after the Supreme Court does its damage. They can start fighting some of that, but we have to recognize that ultimately the Department of Justice is going to be somewhat hamstrung, because they ultimately now have to win arguments in front of this Supreme Court, this right-wing activist Supreme Court. So that then leaves the other major option open, which is executive orders. And the more that we need to recognize, the more that Biden, uses executive orders in the short term to kind of stem them off, he's actually kind of strengthening their hand, right? Because they'll just use that as more evidence of the deep state or the tyranny of the Democrats. The same way that they raised that argument, many people thought it was just a joke when they started using that argument of Obama's executive orders as tyranny, but it was a well set up and well played out thing that they blocked any, Mitch in particular, blocked any possibility of legislation to be enacted through Congress, and forced his hand to be like, well, you're going to have to rule basically by a decree. And that enabled two things, right? One, for them to make a successful argument to their base and to move, kind of middle forces more in line with them. But it also set up the executive to have more power in the long term for when they got a hold of it. And that's the same game that's being played now. And then this goes back to the very first point. Like, we are at a stage where it's checkmate, right? It's countermate. Like, whatever one side does is going to heighten the contradiction and the tension to advance this peace forward towards greater civil conflict and strife. But the short order of this piece is, we need to be clear. It might not be a civil war. Let me make that plain. It might just be a rout by the right. Right? They could very easily, under certain terms and conditions, just sweep into power with very little resistance. And it's our job, by having open and discussions in the here and now like this one, and being able to write stuff to try to counter that in the here and now, like sound the alarm. And if it doesn't wind up being, my point is, some people are like, well, do you think you're being too alarmist? Well, let's say it is. It turns out history does say it was over alarmist, but to the degree that we got prepared to defeat the worst, actually strengthens us. So there's no way we can really go wrong by doing the type of organizing that's going to be necessary to either move something forward or to prevent something bad from happening.
Right, but I mean, what I'm really pleased about in your essay was that you constantly refer to the USA empire, and I think that's a really important concept to grasp. And in that context, I mean, the USA is not the only place that has faced
Right.
the threat of fascism. We've had Chile, we've had Argentina, we've had
Spain,
Egypt,
Portugal,
we've
right.
had Spain, we've had India, and so
Right.
on, which you pointed out earlier on. But what lessons can we draw from those experiences? And I mean, there's quite an interesting comment by Anna Brown saying, is this the way we should be going? Are we seeking to build collective zones like the Zapatistas are doing in Chiapas? I mean, what are the lessons? What needs to be done? What can we draw upon that can inform what needs to be done in the USA?
Well, I would say we need that and then some. There's a lot to learn from, I would say, honestly, in both the positive and the negative, from what has happened in Chiapas since 1994. There's a whole hell of a lot to be learned from what has happened in Rojava, over the last, decade. Again, both positive and negative. But in terms of some, I think, things that maybe mirror more our experience, I would point people into really looking at really how the whole southern cone of Latin America dealt with about 40 years of right-wing dictatorships, that gripped Argentina, that gripped Chile, that gripped Brazil, and how all of them, the one I know best in particular, are the movements in Brazil and Argentina, wherein left forces embedded themselves in land struggles. They embedded themselves in the trade union struggles, and over a gradual period of time built up, figured out how to utilize both clandestine means of ways of organizing, but also public means of organizing through the institutions that had been somewhat still legitimized by the state. Now they try to, in Brazil and in Argentina, the CIA and the AFL-CIA, tried to use a number of different methods to turn those unions, against the left and move them towards the right orientation, with some success, but also not as successful as they wanted to. But people utilize the vehicles of the church. They utilize the vehicles of the unions to continue their deep organizing and political work, and to counter the fascists and the military dictatorships. And we're going to have to learn from that. But then there's also things that we have to learn about how white supremacy and fascism have been practiced in this country all along, and remember the lessons of how I can draw best from my experience of how folks utilize some of those same institutions, particularly like the church, in the Black community from the end of Reconstruction well up until the 1960s, as a major source of resistance, right? Community support, leadership development, resource mobilization, all those things under the cover of organizing in these small little, more often, poor ass Baptist and Pentecostal, churches or AME churches or whatever. But these were where the system kind of nurtured these or allowed these to exist as places where they were going to try to shift political energy, and then people just figured out the political sophistication to continue doing the political work in any and all the spaces they had available to continue to struggle. And that's a place that we might have to go to, right? And so it's good to start studying that, right now. And one of the things I've been, put it out here, I've been encouraging everybody, and I'll do it again here, to to understand a lot of this dynamic that we are living through, first start, a lot of people want to go to Germany and with the Nazis, and there's a lot to learn there, no question. But the American dynamic, I think, is best situated with understanding what happened during Reconstruction and then the redemption movements that happened. And if you want to get a good foundation in that, you got to start with Black Reconstruction in America by W.E. Du Bois. Everybody go get you a copy or download it, read it, and start some study groups on that as part of your preparation for this period going forward.
Great, great. I mean, I think there's an interesting question that would be worthwhile getting your view on. And Anna Brown again says, what's the role of arts, culture, and so on play in organizing? I mean, we are humans, we love, we create, we enjoy the aesthetics, we have music, we have whatever. What's the role, without, in a sense, instrumentalizing it?
A major role. In my view, part of what this call should be, we need all the cultural workers out there, whatever your craft is, be it digital or music or visual. People need to be dedicating very explicit time and resources now in all the venues, the TikToks and the Instagrams and the Twitter and the Facebook, of both sounding the alarm, but encouraging folks to get organizing along the lines laid out, I would say, hopefully in this paper and other things that people can suggest, because a lot of the cultural work and the cultural currency is going to particularly reach far more young people than somebody reading my essay, for instance, right? And a good art piece will stimulate something. A good musical piece will stimulate folks to go, deeper down some rabbit holes. So we need to call out all the folks who have some pull and influence in that regard, to take some risks and start getting this message out there and encouraging folks to get organized. I think that's, for me, that's a prime target to start moving folks to elicit some motion in this particular manner. And I think at least, I know like the hip hop world, probably the best in this regard, trying to reach some of the critical forces for them to put some things out. Because that will spread more like wildfire, just given the nature of how society is presently organizing than me and you talking here and now. But we're trying to get to, get in their ear for them to put it out there. So, it reaches millions in the span of a few minutes, that at least shorten some of the distance and heighten some of the awareness of what needs to get done.
Right. One further question from Christina Jaforos. Do you believe there's a lack of vision on the left, making it difficult to organize and produce? And I'm in a, it's easy to say, yeah, of course it's all disintegrated and so on. But what can be done? What are the basis for building these united fronts that you referred to earlier on?
Well, let me redirect. I think some of the building blocks are already there. That's what I'm trying to allude to. Do they go far enough and deep enough? No. Do they have some potential? Some of the forces I named and winning beyond that. Do they have the potential to reach far more people? Yes. That I think has been demonstrated time and time again. At least within the last 10 years. And I try to make it plainer. Like, I'm not suggesting something that we haven't seen within the direct experience of millions of people. The question is, can we elicit that and coordinate it and get it organized to the point of kind of just a one-on-one, that if we call something, we have a clear sense of who will show up and what their capacities are, because we've been in touch and made some plans, and did some assessment of ourselves and our skills and what we aim to do and to what extent we're willing to do it. Those bases of organizing to be able to move, this agenda or agenda like this going forward. Like, that is a critical piece. But I think the thing that I think needs to happen between now and I think June, just being honest, is the conversations about people's analysis of what's going down, and then stepping out there to start taking some risk. Like, that is the thing I think I think I'm gonna use some terms I don't exactly like, but I think they kind of best describe the situation between kind of like your party left and your social movement left, and we have far more of a social movement left than anything like a party left in the United States. And the social movement piece is largely kind of concentrated right now in any organized sense in nonprofits, and a lot of them are somewhat weary about calling for things that might bring them under the purview of the state. That caution is going to have to be thrown to the wind, right? And some real risk is going to have to be taken. So, to the extent that folks need to start waging political struggle, those in that sector, who are embedded there, start convincing their boards, start convincing their funders, that this kind of risk and stuff is going to be necessary. People need to start doing that in the here and now, and be very clear with, the type of, to give it a structural name, the Popular Front orientation that many of these nonprofits are already in, because and I say that because of folks' relationship to philanthropic capital, and yes, it is capital, see it for what it is. That they will either support or withhold resources for certain things, but in particular their interests. Again, we have to organize in our interests, and there's going to have to be some clear choices within that sector to do things on the basis of what's required rather than the basis of what's going to get funded.
Right. Couple more questions. I think that's probably all we have time for. Danja Buckmore says, can we interrupt this process, though? I mean, how inevitable are these escalations? Can we make strategic choices in how we build and fight to avoid an outright civil war while also prepping for the worst? And a similar question posed by Alec Martinez. How do we develop a liberated economy without spurring the violent oppression of the state and indeed of the right? We tried to on the border and got harassed by the FBI. Would you like to respond to those?
The sad question, the sad answer, I think, to that last one is there is no way to avoid the state being the state, particularly this state being itself. So we have to build with the understanding that what we build is going to be attacked in a number of different ways, like, audits being one way, invasive audits and other type of investigations, but there's all outright hostility or city ordinances banning people from doing this or from doing that, or state governments doing the same, etc. So we have to move again with the clarity that we have to do what is needed, right, and not necessarily totally submit ourselves to the changing notions of legality that exist now and are definitely going to get worse in the future. Now, can we avoid conflict? No. Can we better prepare for conflict? Absolutely. Right. And I'm just one, I always try to keep it real, like, it ultimately is going to come down to a fight with these bourgeois forces. And it's we best to be clear about that from jump and do our best to determine, on what are going to be the grounds and conditions upon which we fight and how we fight, right? Because there's more than one way to engage in struggle. We should always remember that. And there's always choices to how we engage. But ultimately today, they are not going to change and give up their control and their privileged position within the system without being dislodged from it. We need to be clear about that. And that means as we are striving to do that, they're going to do everything within their power to keep power, right? And to maintain it. So start getting prepared, and getting your community prepared for different forms of backlash, different forms of conflict, because it's coming. That's the nature of the time, the nature of the period. And we need to be clear that the better we get at being organized, the more repression is going to come. That is just a sad reality, but we're going to have to turn a lot of it on its head and demonstrate, move people from the fear of certain types of target and repression, but build the strength to get people on the necessity of of why this is necessary, and not just retreat or submit to their rule, thinking that that's going to be the easiest or the safest way out, because in the end it won't be.
I mean, I think the most important lesson I take from what you're saying is that that there is no choice but to engage with it politically. Self-defense is not merely an armed question. It's a question of
Right.
building the confidence, the capacity, the ability to organize, to build alliances, and really a community that believes in itself and can confront politically the threat of civil war and violence. That yes, it's probably inevitable, but the response to that has to be go beyond merely a militaristic response
Right.
to it, and I think that's really really important. Uh, there's I think there's so many questions and comments, and I think we've probably exhausted everyone, if not you.
Well, I would ask this, just out of respect to everybody and the time. Number one, thank everybody for asking questions, for being here, for engaging,
Yeah.
for taking this up, whether you agree or disagree. We got to have these conversations, right? That the situation requires for. But I would ask for Rose, if please send me a lot of these questions, because I'm gonna continue, playing my role of trying to write about this and move different forces to this. So I would love to see the questions and respond to them, maybe in another piece that we're me and some other folks are working on. And I would encourage a lot of you, who are raising questions, to also, put some things out, with your perspective, because it's going to take a hive mind to get us out of this. Singular mind that can't cover everything, and so we're gonna have to pull our caps together to kind of figure this out.
Yes, well, yeah, I completely agree, and I'd like to thank all the people who registered and who've been on the show and who've asked questions, made comments. I'm sorry we can't deal with everything, but we will keep a record of this. Everything here is recorded on YouTube, but we will also put the entire interview on our website, and we will provide an audio only version of it for those, especially in the global south where bandwidth isn't great, to be able to listen to this. Kali, thank you so much for sparing your time. I thought it was really helpful discussion. I think we covered a lot of ground, but I think raised important issues that all of us need to be reflecting on. And so, once again, a really warm thanks to you, Kali, for helping us think through some of these issues intelligently and with empathy, warmth, and love. And if that's not the basis for building the future, what is?
That's right. Thank you, Feroz. Okay. Let's do it again and again. Thanks, everybody who engaged with us today and participated. Let's build.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. All the best then. And thanks to everyone participating. Okay. We'll end off with my favorite music again. And we'll go for it. You stay on, Kali, and we'll talk a little.